we're going to go from the ridiculous to the sublime. We're in Bill's story, chapter 1, and I believe we got up as far as page 14. If you'd like to open your books up to that page, please. What I like to do before we get into the new material is to make sure we get ourselves all up to date here and we're on the same page. As we read through Bill's story, you will remember that after Ebby had come to visit him and after Bill had gotten the idea that Ebby knew what he's talking about and that in fact he had progressed quite a ways down the road of recovery, and Bill figured he'd better listen to him. And Ebby began to teach him what he had already learned. And you remember that was just 2 months of recovery for Ebby. If you listen to some of the gurus around the rooms these days, with 2 months sobriety, Ebby was supposed to be sitting back quietly, keeping his mouth shut and his ears open, and not saying a word to anybody, and certainly would not be eligible to be helpful to another alcoholic. I'm really glad Ebby didn't know that. And as Bill was working with Ebby, he got into the natural quandary that all agnostics have, believing that maybe there was a God, but how could this God be personal to him? How could this God have any real interest in any one human being? Until Ebby showed him that it was only necessary that he be willing to believe, and that he was able to choose any conception of God he wished to do. And it was that which allowed Bill to have his epiphany, which allowed Bill to work his second step. Now, of course, as we read through the earlier pages in Bill's story, we found him taking the first step over and over again. It was that he recognized his powerlessness, he recognized that alcohol was his master, he recognized that he could not stop drinking, that he was totally defeated. So we saw Bill take his first and second steps, and then we saw him get into the hospital for the last time. And while he was in the hospital, Ebby came to him, and Ebby was showing him how to work the steps of the Oxford Society, group, movement. Somebody's been checking all this stuff out and been correcting me. Apparently I've been wrong all this time. And that's terrible. I hate him for that. So now I'm completely confused, but the Oxfordians, let's call them that. Anyway, there's 6 steps, and as Bill actually went through those steps, and we checked this out last week, remember on page 13. And Bill had worked the first 2 steps, and in the hospital he worked 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 11. And that left out 10 and 12. Now the reason 10 isn't in there, because as we discussed last week, 10 didn't come along till sometime quite later. The Oxfords did not believe that it was necessary to do anything to stay current, to constantly know what our present reality was. They didn't think it was necessary for us to keep up with the defects of character as they cropped up again, because they thought, and their doctrine was, that one would become perfect in many ways. So all they had to do after they'd worked the steps was to go out and carry the message. Our guys found that that was not enough, and that they were suffering severely because the world and all of its people continued to threaten them, and the threat equaled fear, and the fear equaled the recurrence of defects of character. As a result of that, the 10th step was born. It was born of necessity, of trial and error, and eventually became settled. And by the time Bill wrote the big book, there was the 10th step, and it was in full bloom. The 12th step we're going to see tonight, and we're going to see that the 12th step came to Bill, and he actually worked the 12th step, or at least began the process of working the 12th step while he was still in the hospital. Now, I don't know for sure how many days he was in the hospital, but it wasn't very long. And I guess we have to remember that when people tell us that, oh, don't rush your steps. You don't have to work steps that fast. Wait, listen, here's what I want you to do. I want you to prove to me that you're really serious. And that means you will come to 90 meetings in 90 days. And if you have done that, then we'll sit down and see if maybe you might want to start your steps. We'll have to see about that. In the meantime, call me every day or I'll fire you. When I came into this fellowship, the rule was 9 steps in 90 days or less. And most people did it much less time than that. Bill did the steps while he was still in the hospital. In any event, we're going to see that 12th step as it blossoms out, and it comes to Bill, as we shall see, as a matter of grace. Now, I'd like to kind of pick up from where we saw Bill working the first 11 steps in the hospital, and let's go back to page 13 down at the bottom of the page so we don't miss anything here as we lead into the rest of the story. Now, Bill had worked these steps and he had found great peace and serenity already. My friend promised when these things were done, I would enter upon a new relationship with my Creator, that I would have the elements of a way of living which answered all my problems. It's a very important statement, isn't it? Many people believe, I do, and will tell you, especially if they've been around for a little while, that the answers to all of our problems are right here in this book. And I believe that absolutely. Answer all my problems. Belief in the power of God, plus enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain the new order of things were the essential requirements. Now, belief in the power of God comes first there, of course, as it should. And remember that that is something which has already taken place in our second step, hasn't it? Because in our second step we come to believe that there is a God and that God is everything and has all power. And so belief in the power of God, that's where it all starts. And then willingness, honesty, and humility. Now, a lot of people are of the impression that somehow or another willingness, honesty, and humility are things which we are able to convince ourselves to have or will ourselves to have, or that somehow or another if we don't do that there's something wrong with us, when in actual fact these are things which we cannot get on our own. We can do all kinds of humility exercises. We can do all sorts of things to try to show our honesty. But somewhere along the line there has to be the intervention of a loving God. And the fact of the matter is that these things do come to us in our fifth step. I want to show you that. Turn to page 73, please. This is at the beginning of the fifth step. Go down 4 lines from the top of page 73. They took inventory all right, but hung on to some of the worst items in stock. They only thought they had lost their egoism and fear. They only thought they had humbled themselves. But they had not learned enough of humility, fearlessness, and honesty in the sense we find it necessary until they told someone else all their life story. Turn that around and you see the truth of it. When we tell someone else all our life story, then we are granted the humility and the honesty and the fearlessness necessary for us to have in order to gain all of the benefits of the steps and to reach a spiritual awakening. That's what that means. Bill says back here in his story that these are essentials, and of course they are. But we make a mistake when we feel that somehow or another these things are outside the realm of God's power, and they are something that we ought to be able to capture for ourselves. We've never been able to do it in the past. Let's take honesty, for example. Dishonesty is one of our cardinal defects over which we have no power. And that's why when we do our 4-step, we locate our dishonesties. That's why when we do our 5th step, we admit our dishonesty, and why when we get to our 7th step, we ask God for help with it and to take away this defect of character. Because we have no power, any more than we have power over alcohol, any more than we have power over selfishness and self and resentments and fears. All of these things are result of the twists of our natural God-given instincts, and we therefore have no power through our own unaided will to correct them. We need God's help in every instance. The same thing is true of humility. You know, you can say, boy, I've got to learn to be humble. Now, if you've been saying that, you might want to ask yourself, how do I do that? How do I learn to be humble? You know, what really happens is that as we go through the steps, we come to understand thoroughly that God does indeed have all the power, and that His will is going to be done whether we like it or not. And when we have finally accepted that as a fact, there's nothing left for us to be egotistical or prideful about. Because now we have ascribed to God all the power, and we have committed our lives to Him. Humility then is something which comes to us because we work the steps, and we have come to a point where our faith has grown, where we have had a spiritual awakening. And in the process of that spiritual awakening, humility is just one of the things which comes to us. Willingness, we found that we must pray for. There are a dozen places in the Big Book which remind us of that. We don't get willingness on our own. We get willingness by prayer. I'm not talking now about what the Big Book calls the proper use of our will, which is to will ourselves to take right action. It is through right action that our willingness comes. It is through going to God when we are unwilling. For example, in the 6th step, it's quite clear that if we're not willing to let God have all our defects, we pray for the willingness till it comes. In our 8th step, if we're not willing to make amends, we pray for the willingness until it comes. In our 4th step, if we're not willing to forgive the wrongs that have been done us, we ask God to make us willing to do so, and so on. Now, Bill has recognized that these things are essential. He is not saying to us that we have the ability to impose them upon ourselves. Let's go to the next paragraph now, right at the top of page 14. This little paragraph of 4 lines or 3.5 lines sets the tone for the whole Big Book. Let's see what it says. Simple but not easy. A price had to be paid. And so many of us, when we come in here, are willing to accept the miracle, but we're not willing to pay the price. A price had to be paid. It meant destruction of self-centeredness. That little sentence means exactly what it says. Self-centeredness must go. Why? Because self and selfishness and self-centeredness and self-centered fear and self-pity and self-delusion are the things that are killing us. They kill us because they block us from God. There is not room for God and self in the same soul. And so we have to, with God's help, be freed from selfishness. What's the 3rd step prayer? Relieve me of the bondage of self. Means exactly what it says. And then this last sentence on that little paragraph, I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. That does not leave any room, because the Word is all. Turn in all things. Now the big book, you know, we're finding this out already, and we're going to find out more and more as we go through it together. Big book is always consistent. It's never inconsistent. Internally it is consistent. The only book I've ever read that I could say that about without equivocation. Therefore, we would expect to see over and over and over again the same admonition that we must turn in all things to the Father of light. We turn to God in all things. And many of the human solutions which we are bombarded with from time to time ignore this as if it were not even, there was no such thing in our recovery. And I guess for a lot of people there isn't. And if I'm to tell you that you are to take my instructions about how to live your life, how to practice the spiritual way of life, if you are going to follow me, then you are not going to be following God. What I'm really saying to you is, I'll tell you how you must act and what you must do in your life. And if I'm your sponsor and I fail to point out to you that every step of the way your responsibility to yourself and to your Maker is to turn to God and ask Him what He wants you to do. Ask Him what His will is. Stay in a state of surrender. Let's take a couple of examples. It is common wisdom around these rooms, because we find it in some of the treatment center literature, and we find it in the little book called Living Sober. It's nowhere else in the area of literature, but it is there. That you're not supposed to have any kind of relationship for a year. As if somehow or another a year had some magic value, which of course it does not. But that's directly contrary to what the big book says. What's the big book tell us about this? It is consistent with this, that we must turn in all things to the Father of light. What it says to us in the big book is that in our daily meditation we ask Him what we should do about each specific matter. And the right answer will come if we want it. Over and over again we have the same message. Wherever there is a difficulty, wherever we're in any kind of a quandary about what's the next thing to do, what do? We ask God for help. We ask Him to show us what His will is for us, and then we meditate and we wait for the answer. Don't ever make a major decision for your first year. When we just put these things out here blankly like that, in the light of what we're now reading, they become ludicrous. I have no idea where 1 year came from, for example. I guess there had to be some kind of a time limit. It could just have been easily 5 years. Some people are telling us these days, for example, that our minds don't even get cleared up for 5 years, as if somehow 5 years down here all the cobwebs are gone. I'm not sure exactly what that means. We're just sodden dolts for 5 years? And then when I hear that, I think, well, wait a second. The longest sobriety in the fellowship, the time the big book was being written, was a little over 3 years. Many of the people had less than 1 year, and quite a few had less than 6 months. As a matter of fact, somebody who was 6 months sober in those days was a veteran. They were already sponsoring people, and they were supposed to be. They knew it, and everybody took it for granted. These days, heck, you're not allowed to get up here and conduct a meeting if you haven't got 2 years sobriety. I know people with 2 years sobriety I wouldn't trust with one thing about this program. They haven't got the foggiest idea what the hell they're talking about. I know people with 3 or 4 months sobriety I'll listen to anytime. So I'm wondering about these time limits. I don't know why in the world we insist on doing that. I guess what's going on here? Okay. I guess we feel the necessity of having some sort of rules and regulations, even though our traditions tell us that we don't have any. But the human animal can't seem to abide that vacuum. We just have to make rules, you know. We have to, and especially if you've been around for a while, everybody's going to have to do what you want them to do anyway. You know, that's just natural with us. But we really need to watch what we're doing, because what's happening with all this stuff is that we're running directly contrary to what the Big Book tells us. When a newcomer has been here and has gone through his or her steps and has had a spiritual awakening, the 12 steps says that he or she has had a spiritual awakening and immediately tries to carry this message to other alcoholics. What in the heck does that mean? Does it mean you got to wait a year or 2 years until your sponsor tells you it's okay? I don't think so. This stuff is either true or it's false, and that's a big problem we have. We like to look at the Big Book as if it's an inspired document and all that, but then if it doesn't suit us, we will figure, oh, that's old-fashioned, outmoded, with a bunch of waspy old guys sitting around smoking cigars, and they didn't, you know, that was then, this is now, and it's all more modern now, and we got to, you know, on and on and on. The problem is with that is that it ignores the fact that millions of people have recovered by doing exactly what this Big Book says. Do we simply ignore that as a fact? I guess a lot of people don't even know it. But anyway, I'm preaching, and I'm sorry about that, but this turning in all things the Father of light who presides over us all is the keynote of this book. It is what we must depend upon. It is what we must learn to do. If you go to the 11th step, for example, it tells us that as we go through each day, if in any sense we're confused or doubtful, we turn immediately to God and we ask Him, God, thy will not mine be done. Show me what you want me to do here, God. And that if we do that, our day just turns out one heck of a lot better. And it always does. That always works. This is a lesson that is so critical for us to learn. We're not running things anymore. Bill goes on to say this now on page 14. These were revolutionary and drastic proposals, but the moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. Now then, here's a kind of an interesting thing, guys. These next few sentences are about Bill's epiphany, his bright light, burning bush experience. That tremendous spiritual experience which he had, which stayed with him for the rest of his life. And yet, the way he describes it here, you'd have to know this is what he's talking about. In other literature, in other writings, he talks about it extensively. Let's see what he said here. He accepted these drastic revolutionary proposals. The effect was electric. There was a sense of victory followed by such a peace and serenity as I had never known. There was utter confidence. I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but His impact on me was sudden and profound. And nowhere here does he tell us that it was at this point that Bill was moved to appeal to God. And the way he did it, and he tells us about this in some of the other writings, he said, I began to pray, and I said, in effect, God, if you're there, please show yourself to me. In another place, which is reported, and as Bill sees it, he said, I learned I had to pray just as if there were a God. And then when the miracles started coming, and I could no longer deny that they came from a power greater than myself, that's when faith came, and faith was the greatest gift of all. And so this is describing what happened when Bill was willing to go to the God who just might exist and ask Him, show yourself to me, please, God. And God did. And Bill many times wrote that this experience, this tremendous spiritual experience, stayed with him for the rest of his life. Now it's very important to read that last sentence, because that last sentence teaches us exactly what we need to know. God comes to most men gradually. That's you and me. Except maybe there are one or two in here who have had an epiphany. But for most of us, the growth of this kind of spiritual experience leading to a spiritual awakening is a gradual thing. And it is brought about by the fact that we work the steps and take one leap of faith after another and experience God working in our lives over and over again to a point where we can no longer deny that He is not only there, but that He loves us and He wants the best for us, and that we can trust Him. Of course, the impact on Bill was sudden, and our agnostic and atheist friends back in those days, Jim B., my namesake, being one of them, didn't like this. They didn't like the idea that God was being appealed to right from the beginning, that He appeared in almost all the steps. And they agitated and lobbied for an explanation which would base itself on the idea that somehow or another you and I are so stupid when we read this book we can't read what that sentence says, that it will come to us gradually, and that a few receive this as a sudden inspiration. And 3 other times in the big book we are told exactly the same thing. As a result of that, in the second printing of the first edition, as a matter of compromise, there was added to the big book Appendix 2, which starts out on the false premise that all of us are so dumb we can't read what the words say, and we're all going to be confused, thinking that we have to have an epiphany before we can recover. And certainly that is not true. And all of that leads up to the one point that these guys wanted to make. And we find it toward the end of that Appendix 2, where they're talking about the coming of a sense of a higher power. And they wrote, our more religious members call it God consciousness, which was designed to separate those who call God consciousness from those who are not religious and don't claim to be, and claim, as a matter of fact, to be agnostic or whatever. And of course that's directly contrary to what the big book tells us on page 85, that to some extent we will all become God conscious, and it hasn't anything whatsoever to do with religion. The reason I bring this up is because it's part of AA so deeply rooted now that many people read that Appendix 2, and in fact there are groups that dote upon that, and I think it's important to understand where it came from and how it directly contradicts the big book. That's why it is an appendix, and it was never put into the body of the big book. Now we go down on page 14 again to this third full paragraph. Bill has had his spiritual experience, his epiphany, his bright light. He says, for a moment I was alarmed and called my friend, the doctor, that was Dr. Silkworth, to ask if I were still sane. He listened in wonder as I talked. I can imagine. Finally he shook his head, saying, something has happened to you I don't understand, but you better hang on to it. Anything is better than the way you were. The good doctor now sees many men who have such experiences. He knows that they are real. And Bill did hang on to it. And Dr. Silkworth added one more experience to his growing knowledge of the fact that there was and is a solution, which he did not know before. See, remember when we read his opinion, he made it clear that but for the chronic alcoholic, he just threw his hands up. He had no solution for us. And he stuck us off in one corner of the hospital. We were the incurables. Now then, we come to the 12th step. Bill is still in the hospital. He has worked the first 11 steps. Now let's see what happens. While I lay in the hospital, the thought came that there were thousands of hopeless alcoholics who might be glad to have what had been so freely given me. Perhaps I could help some of them. They in turn might work with others. Do you see AA sitting there? Of course. And here's something of enormous importance to you and me. Had this not happened, had this inspiration not come to Bill, where would we be today? I know I'd have been dead 20 years ago, 30 years ago, who knows? There would be no AA. But Bill was inspired. Bill did come to understand that he needed to do something with what he had been given. Notice that he also was inspired to understand that those he worked with could then go and work with other people. The very basis of our program, how this works. One alcoholic working with another, who works with another, who works with another, and so on and so on and so on. One of the guys I sponsored was telling me the other day, he keeps running into his great-great-grand sponsees. They're all over the place. And I told him years ago, Danny, if you toss a little pebble into that still pond out there, you're going to be amazed how far those little ripples will go. And it's one of the most incredible joys of being in this program is you get to see that happening. Because this message has all the power. God has the power through this message. And when we carry the message and when we teach people carefully how to do it themselves, and they go do it and they teach others, and they go do it and they teach others, and it just spreads out. And you know, if you ever thought of having the opportunity to have an enormous impact on life, this is it right here. Right here. Now, Bill had this inspiration, and he wanted to find out whether he was just hallucinating or whether it was real, so he talked to his friend Abby. Let's go to the next paragraph. My friend had emphasized the absolute necessity of demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. 12th step, right? You see the 12th step developing right here. Demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. I like that word, demonstrating. Think what it means if you compare that with the 3rd step prayer. Remember there in the 3rd step prayer we ask God to take away our difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those we would help of His love, His power, and His way of life, which means we're asking God to make us an example of His power working in our lives by the way we live our lives, to demonstrate these principles in everything that we do, and that this is the most powerful teaching tool we have, because by our actions will we be known. And so this was something which Abby taught him. Going on, he said, particularly was it imperative to work with others as he had worked with me. And again we see the effect of this domino effect. Here was Abby with 2 months sobriety helping Bill. Now Bill was to go out and help others. And Abby is saying, you see what I did with you, Bill, now you must go and do it with the next person down the line. And then Abby said to him, faith without works is dead. This is such an important concept to understand, because it's so easy for us to think that I have faith, but faith as a state of mind without acting upon that faith, in other words, without acting with trust of God, is dead. It has no value. It has no reality. In order to give faith reality and value, we must act upon it. Faith without works is dead. We find that same thought in religious and ecclesiastical literature throughout the world. there is no doubt that that's a truism. But you know, it goes a little further than that too, doesn't it? For example, love as a state of mind is no love at all. Love can only be real when we take loving action. Just thinking love is just a bunch of electrons in collision in our heads. But acting upon love is where love becomes real. And so when we think in terms of, let's say, humility, humility as a state of mind has no value. But when we act with humility, then it becomes real. Gratitude as a state of mind has no reality. But when we act grateful, it becomes real. And it's most especially true with faith. That faith as a state of mind is dead. Faith upon which we act by trusting God in all things is real. And also when we demonstrate our faith in our actions so that others can see, so that others can want what we have, so that others can begin to emulate us, so that they too can learn and they too can recover. And then Bill goes on to say something here which forms the basis of all of our 12-step work, all of our sponsorship work. He says, "Unto how appallingly true for the alcoholic. For if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead." Let's read that again. If an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. And notice that it puts a word in there which you seldom hear around here: self-sacrifice. Work we're talking about a lot. Self-sacrifice you seldom hear, but that's the rule. Which means, of course, simply this, that we're putting the work that we're doing with others ahead of ourselves. We resolutely turn our thoughts to someone we can help. We think about them, and by doing so, we get out of self. Working with others and self-sacrificing for others is one of the surest ways we have of staying out of self. It is the way we have of staying in the now. It's the way we have of fulfilling our responsibilities in that which we prayed for in our 3rd-step prayer and in our 7th-step prayer. And then it goes on to say, if he did not work, he would surely drink again. And if he drank, he would surely die. Then faith would be dead indeed. With us it is just like that. Now there's one other place that we see self-sacrifice. We find it in the traditions. The 12th tradition is based upon the concept of self-sacrifice. 12th tradition doesn't have anything to do with the fear of being discovered as an alcoholic. There's no fear at all in our traditions. They're principles, they're God-given principles, and the principle which we are dealing with in the 12th step is that we are self-sacrificing, which means simply this, that we would want to have acclaim and notoriety and applause for being such wonderful members of AA and for doing all of these good works. And therefore, in order to gain all that, of course, we would want to use our full name so that everybody would know who we are. The 12th tradition reminds us that we are to remain anonymous. That anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all of our traditions, because in the spirit of self-sacrifice, we are sacrificing our human need and desire and wants to be a big shot, to be a power driver, to be recognized, to be a hero or heroine. And we put that all aside. And it requires of us that we be willing to sacrifice all of those wants, needs, and desires for the unity of the fellowship, and in order that we are true to the principles stated by the traditions. And so self-sacrifice then does run through everything that we do in here, and I wish we maybe spoke about a little bit more when we share with each other, because it's not something that, see, self-sacrifice does not mean that I'm doing something that I can turn around and be proud of. Oh, look how self-sacrificing I am. That's not the point at all, is it? It's almost like saying I'm so proud to be so humble, you know. It's like when we do 12-step work, when we're sponsoring somebody, we seek nothing for ourselves. We seek nothing for ourselves. I think I told you I was down in Islamorada, and there's a guy down there who came over and asked me how much I charge for 12-step work. And somebody started a rumor down in North Dade that I charged $75 for a 5th step. And somebody told me that. I said, no, I'd never do it for $75. That's too damn much work. I'll get at least $500 for a 5th step. There's such weird stuff going around. I was talking to a friend of mine today, and I said, you know, life is infinitely interesting because we're dealing with human beings who are themselves infinitely interesting. And when we look at it from that standpoint, we stay sharp and we stay focused and we stay in the now, and we have a wonderful life. Get to have a great life if you stick around here, you know. And those of you who have stuck around for a while, you know what I'm talking about. It's a great life. Sure, you have all kinds of crappy things that happen, but so what? They'd have happened anyway, or maybe worse. But now, guess what? We got God on our side. Instead of having brick walls to run into, we got speed bumps on the parking lot of life, and we even learn how to slow down and go over them slowly so we don't knock our muffler off or something. We got to always remember that the problem is in our pants. Wow. Oh, man. I have to warn you, when we get to the 4th step and we're talking about our sex inventory, we'll be talking a lot more about that. I kind of look forward to it, actually. Okay, I think maybe we've reached a jumping off point or a stopping point or something here, because from here on we're going to see the beginnings of AA. We're going to watch Bill as he began to try to carry the message, and we'll have, as we read all this next week, we're going to trace a little bit more of the history of how this thing got started, because it really, we don't see that again until we get to the 11th step, and it's kind of sketchy there. So the history of the beginnings of this fellowship is really fascinating, and we've just got the bare bones of it here. So we'll do a little bit of discussion about that next week, as well as reading the rest of the chapter. And I want to thank you so very much for allowing me to share this with you today. I always look forward to this meeting. Thank you.